All right, everyone, link in the description to something hilarious. AOC blaming climate change for a heavy rain in DC that started to, I guess, overrun the gutters a little bit. And it's like, you know, I don't know what alternate reality she's living in that a storm can only be ascribed to climate change. Let's assume that climate change is number one anthropogenic, number two a risk, number three irreversible as it continues, and number four specifically man-made, bad, it's real, which I accept actually, it is real. Let's assume all that. Does that mean any particular weather system has to do with that, or is there aberrant weather anyway? Like, the idea that there was never a damaging storm in DC before the Industrial Revolution doesn't hold muster. Why? DC is... There's a reason why Trump uses the term drain the swamp. DC is essentially, for the most part, a backfilled marsh that was at, or in some cases, arguably a little bit below sea level. Most of that particular, Potomac region is nothing more than a giant marsh. The highest point in the entirety of DC is 400 feet above sea level. It's a small hill. Most of DC, though, is around sea level. It's been backfilled, so a lot of it's like, 5-10 feet above. The idea that this isn't a marshy, wet, drippy, inundated area is nuts. If humans were to stop maintaining DC for 100 years, it would go back to looking like nature intended it, with some ruins scattered here and there. They have problems at the Jefferson Memorial. There's some sort of black mold because of the nonstop swampy humidity. The Jefferson Memorial has like black mold on it. They have to scrub it off every other week or some crazy shit. They have to use like chemicals on it and shit. And they're like, oh, it's mysterious. We don't even know why it specifically grows on this particular monument, but it's here. It's probably some soil microbe or something like that crawls up the rock and just releases spores. Check the underlying soil. You might find an endangered species, and then the liberals will say you're not allowed to clean it anymore. No, the Jefferson Memorial has to look like it's been carved out of obsidian. By the way, it'd probably look pretty cool. That's what they'll do. Here's the thing, though. DC is literally a swamp. It's in a very wet climate. It's in a wet, near-coastal, swampy environment. The idea that there's never going to be any flooding in DC is nuts. You're right on the Potomac River anyway. That would flow over its banks at some point. It's like we had that earthquake, how many years ago was it? They had a 5-point-something earthquake right in D.C. It cracked the Washington Monument and everything, and the people were like all fucked out about it. And it was funny at the time. I remember talking about it. Some people were acting like it was an act of God. They gave it like religious importance. Now keep in mind, back then I'm like an anti-religious YouTuber specifically, so it was funny. And I've seen people, and this is really funny, blame earthquakes on climate change. That's actually happened. It's like the seismic events have nothing to do with surface CO2 concentration, but okay. I accept that climate change is real. It's fairly obvious because you can look at temperature trends. That being said, I'm questioning whether it's entirely anthropogenic. I'm sure in part it is. Any human activity on the surface, inevitably through the butterfly effect, has some effect. It's just a matter of finding out how much. And the other part is I'm not sure that it's harmful. Because we've gone through periods before where the CO2 concentration on this planet, I'm sure, has been a lot higher, number one. Surface temperatures have been higher before, number two. They've also been a lot lower. We've had these long-term trends. The idea that human activity is going to destroy the world? No, we can destroy mankind, maybe. The biggest risk to that? Nuclear weapons. Second biggest risk? Bioterrorism. Those are the two biggest risks to man, well, technically biological threats. Nature can do a good job, too. There will never be a disease that's 100% deadly. Even fucking rabies doesn't kill 100% of people. There have been a very small number, like 2 or 3 cases in human history. Someone gets rabies, somehow they recover. Really, really weird. They need to look at those people's genetics. Maybe they can find a cure for it. Veterinarians no longer need to have needles injected in them over and over. Yeah, I can fucking eat this roadkill. It doesn't matter. Oh shit, it had sarcoptic mange. Okay, now I'm fucked. Something like that. The idea that every weather trend, the weather was 100% stable. There were never any bad storms. There was never any flooding, no droughts or anything before the Industrial Revolution. That doesn't make any sense. How can you ascribe any specific severe weather system to that? I can remember, for example, like, 5 or 6 years ago, I think. There was this one summer we had thunderstorm after thunderstorm after thunderstorm. I mean, twice a week almost, we were having severe thunderstorms roll through. We probably had 20 or 30 of them in the course of the year. That's a lot, and they were severe. We're not talking like, there's a few bits of lightning like the last storm we had here. We had a lot of rain, a bit of wind, but ultimately It was only a few lightning strikes. I'm talking like crashing and smashing. Our well got hit. It was funny, our well got hit by the same bolt. This is probably the same bolt that shocked me through the screen door, because it had to have been close in order to do that, was probably the one that hit our well that's right next to the house. It cracked the casing. We didn't even know it at the time. The casing's been cracked all of that time. Finally, it gave out. It sort of degraded. They had to replace it. Thankfully, they didn't have to dig it deeper or anything like that. But the casing was fucked. That wasn't the result of climate change probably either. We got pounded over and over and over again. I think it was La Nina year or something like that. Some weather pattern. This is all natural. It's been happening in the absence of man anyway. It's been, in some cases, I think, documented before the Industrial Revolution. But you can't just say, well, there's climate change, have less SUVs. That's climate change for you. It means more severe weather. Not necessarily. What if happens if it calms the weather down? How do you know? Have you ever gone through a post-industrial period of severe climate change of an anthropogenic and risky character anyway? No, of course not. The Industrial Revolution was 150 years ago. Nobody's ever been through this. We're in untested waters. Humans weren't sophisticated enough in science to test for all of these things 150 years ago. It's like with seismicity, and I pointed this out. When people ramble about Yellowstone's gonna blow, there were more earthquakes this year than last. We've only been comprehensively able to test things of a seismic nature. It's been 100 years of testing and about 40 years of sophisticated testing. You're talking the 80s, basically, or arguably the 70s. Okay, half a century of testing that involved computations of a mechanical nature that were any good. And that's basically it. So how the hell am I going to look at a long-term trend of seismicity in Yellowstone or anywhere else? I can't. I can just look at the stuff that you've already got. It's the same with climate change. They take an ice core sample, they take CO2 testing, whatever, and they say, well, CO2 levels are rising, surface temperature rose, they must therefore there must be a cause. Correlation and causation seems to escape some people that are very good scientists overall. Some people will call you a conspiracy theorist if you suggest, hey, maybe at least part of this is due to nature. Maybe that supercell wasn't the result of anthropogenic climate change. Maybe it was just a storm, because they happen sometimes. You can say they become more common or something like that because of climate. Okay, maybe so. The surface temperature rises, weather patterns change. Granted, of course. But that doesn't mean that it's catastrophic, wipes out mankind, and we need to eliminate cow farts and transatlantic travel. It doesn't make any sense. I'm of the mind that there's probably a feedback mechanism anyway. I'm of the mind that if climate change is truly that risky, it'll kill off half of mankind, the emissions drop, man goes back to the Stone Age and the population dwindles to a few million people, and the problem solves itself. Sucks to be human, doesn't suck to be nature. The Earth will be just fine. It'll reabsorb all that pollution and radioactivity and everything that was already in the Earth anyway. What is plastic other than a bunch of atoms that we've reassembled that happen to be less degradable? They'll degrade in due time. We can poison the Earth for 100 years. After 100 years, it'll be like we were never here in the first place, in many cases. There'll be some ruins here and there. The pyramids will still be there. Sphinx will still be there, kind of. Apparently, that had to be repaired 4 or 5 times by just the Romans because the water, through a capillary action, leaches up through into the bottom structure of the porous sandstone, actually begins to flake and degrade it. They've actually had to rebuild the Sphinx several times, basically. By the way, it probably was Anubis at first. They probably whacked its head off. It was probably unstable, so they said, fuck, the ear fell off. Well, I guess we might as well just put the pharaoh's face on it. Who fucking gives a shit? Those Greeks say that it's a cool story. Yeah, the DC stuff. If it rains, it's climate change. If it's too dry, it's climate change. Hot or cold, too much wind, no breeze at all. It's all the result of man. How egotistical must you be to think that we have really that much of an impact? I'm not buying it. That's about all. Peace out.